I was 16 in my junior year of high school. I had 9 periods in a school day. 5th period was lunch, and straight from there was my astronomy class. My astronomy class was actually held in one of the 2 basement classrooms of the school. My high school was big, there were 3 floors, and even that wasn't enough to accommodate all the classes offered, so the school built 2 classrooms in the basement. It was honestly kind of creepy down there when nobody else was around. It used to be a janitorial area, however it was remodeled to better resemble a typical hallway. The only thing, there were no intercoms or loudspeakers down in the basement at that time. For that reason, no classes were held down there first period for the morning announcements. Everyone referred to this little section of the basement as the chamber, and everyone always tried to get classes down there just because it was air conditioned and the classes were typically easier. Plus it had its own bathroom down there. We had a quiz in astronomy that day. Usually I was one of the first done just because I found the class easy. After I finished my quiz, I texted my friend who was in the other basement classroom to meet me in the bathroom because I was bored. He told me okay. I walked out of the classroom and down the small hallway to the bathroom. A few seconds later, the door opened and my friend JJ entered the bathroom. We were joking around for a while, until JJ checked his phone and said someone texted him saying the school was going on lockdown. We both looked at each other with the same grins. Neither of our teachers saw us leave the classrooms. That meant we had free range of the school while it was on lockdown. We agreed to sneak upstairs and look around the hallways just for the hell of it. The worst that would happen is that we'd explain how we couldn't hear the announcements in the basement classrooms. Upon opening the basement door to the main floor, we were surprised to find all the lights had been turned off, so the hallways were pretty much pitch black aside from the light pouring in from the doors in the lobby. This was legit because usually the lights were left on in the hallways during lockdowns. Something was going down, and we didn't know if we were even comfortable walking around now. JJ stepped out a little further into the hallway, and I followed suit. JJ then looked down the hall and said, "Who's that?" I looked, and emerging from the darkness was a man. At first we couldn't tell if he was a teacher or not, but as he got closer we realized this guy wasn't dressed at all like any staff member. He was dressed like a bum. "Alright, let's go," I told JJ as we hurried back down to the basement. He surely saw us, whoever he was. We saw both classrooms had their doors shut and lights off, so to avoid making a scene, we decided to hide in the bathroom. I shut the light first thing and then we both went to hide in the corner stall. There was complete silence in the room, no ventilation, no heaters, nothing. Just the sound of me and JJ breathing, and an occasional drip from the sink. The door to the bathroom suddenly opened, and light from the hallway poured into the bathroom for a brief moment. The door shut, and the bathroom was once again pitch black. Me and JJ tried our best to control our breathing. The room was so silent that we could hear somebody walking over to our side of the bathroom. The person stopped and started breathing really heavily, as if they were out of breath. Me and JJ were both scared to death. JJ did something very dumb. He whispered in my ear, "We have to crawl out through the other stalls." The room was so silent, however, that even JJ's whisper could be heard from across the room. The heavy breathing outside the stall stopped, and the person tried pressing the stall door in. That was when I whispered, "Go, go," to JJ. We both crawled under the sidewall to the next stall over, and then the next stall, and then finally out to the other side of the bathroom. The person was now full on banging on the stall door. Me and JJ hopped up off the floor, opened the door, and as the light filled the room again, we saw the guy from upstairs in the corner. We pounded on the door to JJ's class. The teacher let us in within seconds. JJ explained everything as the teacher locked the door, mentioning a gun sticking out of the man's pocket. I was shocked to hear this because I didn't see a gun, but I went along with it anyway. Usually a bunch of high school students would be laughing their asses off at 2 students causing a scene like this, but I noticed all the kids sitting in the corner looked concerned. A sudden bang at the door made everyone jump and a couple of girls squeal out of fear. JJ, the teacher, and I could see the man standing at the door, looking through the window while trying the doorknob. After a few bangs on the door out of what seemed to be anger, he turned and walked down the hallway back to the stairs. We don't know how much longer the lockdown went on for, but for over an hour we sat in silence in the room, other than the teacher occasionally asking me and JJ questions in a very concerned tone, shaking his head after everything we would tell him. Eventually, somebody from upstairs called the teacher and he instructed all of us to single file walk up the stairs and out of the building, where we would be greeted by cops. Me and JJ did the best we could at describing the man to the cops and to the dean. One of the cops patted me on the back and we were sent off to go home. After this incident, the school installed cameras everywhere and ramped up the security budget. This incident never got media attention, so honestly we never found out if police caught the guy. I'm convinced that man had no other intentions but to kill us then and there in that bathroom stall. I'm a retired New Jersey police officer. Throughout my 20 years in the force, the most disturbing call I ever received was for a school lockdown happening at a nearby middle school, of which I'll leave out the name for legal reasons. It happened on a stormy, dark day. My car number was called on the radio to respond to a lockdown, where a suspicious-looking man was seen stepping out from a white van parked behind a school and walking into the back door by the boys' locker room. I pulled up to the back parking lot of the school, right next to the white van. Nobody was inside and all the doors and trunk were locked. I opened the red back door that entered into the gym hallway, right by the locker rooms. The main lights had been turned off, so the whole inside of the school was dark. I unholstered the flashlight from my belt and used it to navigate the halls. I made it to the lobby of the school, where a woman emerged from the front office quietly, telling me to check the boys' locker room, but to be careful because the person might be armed. I called for backup on my radio and was assured backup was already on the way. I made it back to the hallway I entered from, where I found the boys' locker room right next to the exit. I pushed it open very quietly. There were no windows in the rooms, therefore there was no light whatsoever in that locker room. Only the light provided by the flashlight. There was a white noise in the room, some kind of vent on the ceiling blowing air, but even over that, I was hearing faint scratching type noises or little dings on the locker doors from the other side. I was supposed to make my presence as a police officer known, but honestly, I was just too scared. The tension in the room was insane. I held my flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other as I snuck to the other side of the locker room. It seemed like wherever I was in the room, the dings and thuds would be coming from the other side. I was standing in the corner of the locker room, right by the door to the bathroom, when the sound of someone slamming a locker door from another room made me jump out of my skin. I went in the direction where I heard the slam, to find out that it was from the boys' football team locker room. There was no door separating the main locker room from the football locker room. The lockers in here were also 3 times the size. I finally had the nerve to make my presence known by shouting police. After shouting, a kid started screaming help from somewhere in the room. It was very muffled though. The kid pounded on a locker door on the other side of the row I was in. When I found out that the boy was trapped inside of a locker, I felt sick in my stomach. I told him I'd be right back, once again calling for backup while running outside to where the white van was. It was gone. My biggest mistake was not getting the plate number first thing. I told dispatch to be on lookout for a suspicious white van. I ran back into the school and instructed the staff in the front office to end the school day and to send somebody with a key to the locker room to get the boy out of the locker. The boy was held by the man with a knife on his back, as I speculate the man was quietly trying to get the 12-year-old boy to his van. The boy was bleeding on his arm from the man cutting him while resisting. The man's van was spotted a week later in a 7-Eleven parking lot, where he was arrested after being properly identified. I was staying in a Hampton Inn in New Jersey when I was visiting Rowan University, a college I potentially wanted to attend. My family couldn't come with me, so I was on my own. After attending campus tours, I went to get a bite to eat at a nearby restaurant, and then went back to the hotel at around 8 p.m., planning on going back to campus again the next day. About an hour after returning to my room, a strange alarm started going off in my room, along with a white light flashing from the corner of the ceiling. A message started looping shortly after as well, saying something along the lines of, "All Hampton Inn guests, please remain in your rooms, this is a lockdown." I'd never heard of a lockdown in a hotel. I never even knew hotels had alarms like this. I found it more interesting and exciting than anything else. Eventually the sound of the alarm stopped, but the light kept flashing, and every 20 seconds or so the message would repeat. It was only like 9:30, so I turned on the TV just as background noise while I started changing clothes and brushing my teeth. I shut the lights when I was done and hopped under the covers. I watched TV for half an hour before shutting it off. The light was still flashing with an obnoxious bright white every few seconds. It was definitely going to hinder my sleep. I was starting to consider calling the front desk to ask what was going on, when the phone rang. It was someone from the front desk. I was expecting them to tell me something about the alarm and when it would shut off, but instead the person on the other end spoke in a very concerned voice. She told me to remain calm and walk out the door. I took that opportunity to ask her what exactly was going on. She went on to tell me that there was somebody in the room with me and to get out immediately. I dropped the phone and instinctively started looking around everywhere. Part of me was curious to see if somebody was in fact in the room. I checked under the bed, looked into the empty bathroom, nobody in either spot. Then I noticed the closet door right next to the bathroom. It was one of those closets with a wooden sliding door. It was open just a tiny crack, and through that tiny crack, I could see a person's face. At first, it didn't sink in what I was seeing, but when the door slid shut, that was when I freaked out and ran out the door. The people at the front desk showed me security footage from an hour earlier of some sketchy-looking man walking around the hallways, apparently looking for a certain room. When he got to my door, he opened it with the card he somehow acquired, and that was it. I stayed around as the authorities took the person out in chains. It was a man, of course, on the shorter side, easily 40s. He looked at me as he passed, as if he knew who I was immediately. It's scary thinking back that he may have been watching me for more than an hour from that closet. When me and my troublemaking friends were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do would be Saturday night ding-dong ditch sessions. 10 years ago, we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. At the time, there were a lot less houses and more woods though. I'm going to make up names for my friends for the case of this story. There was Mark, James, and Matt. Either Mark or James were usually the ones to go up to the houses and ring the bells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would usually find hiding spots right away. We hit about 5 or 6 houses. I remember all of the men who answered the doors gave pretty much the same reactions. They'd step out onto the stoop, one or two would yell something, and then they'd walk back inside. For a couple of houses, we'd ring the bell again for a better reaction. One guy yelled he was calling the cops the second time, so when he shut his door, we all booked it down the street and went to the next block over. As I mentioned, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, there were patches of wood sitting where houses sit today. On the next block over, there were a few patches of wood surrounding some of the houses, and the houses on this block seemed to be more unkempt. The first house on the block was across the street from a patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was kind of run down looking. tall grass, a ratty old car with a cover on it in the driveway, and overall just a small house. Mark went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to make it across the street before the door opened. It was another man to answer the door. This guy really big, about 6 foot and stocky build. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked around his whole front yard, checking the bushes, yelling threats. We all laughed as we always did. Eventually, he finally went back inside. Mark waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up the stoop to ring the bell again. I didn't envy him with this house. I would not be bold enough to ring that man's bell again. Mark knew he probably didn't have as much time, so he ran to the side of the house and out of sight. The door opened much quicker this time, and this time the man came out with a rifle in his hand. We all looked at each other, simultaneously going, "Oh shit," under our breath. The man checked all the places he checked before, and then a few extra places this time, like behind his car, behind a couple trees, and then he walked to the center of his lawn and just stood there, as if he were thinking. He looked around, and then his head stopped as he was facing us in the woods. Me, Matt, and James looked at each other. We ducked lower in hopes that he didn't see us. After 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man went back into his home. And then, we saw him appear at his front window, standing still like a statue, looking in our direction in the woods once again. We saw Mark creeping back over to the man's front door, but there was nothing we could do. We were too afraid to move or yell anything. Mark rang the bell once again and ran for it. The man didn't move though, at least not for another minute. Then he turned and walked away from the window. We didn't see Mark again, but we were still too nervous to move or say anything. The next thing I remember, we heard Mark's voice from across the street yelling, "Run." We didn't understand until we heard someone running up from behind us, realizing upon turning our heads that it was the man from across the street with his rifle in hand, pointed at us. We ran like little prey from a predator to Mark, who was waiting for us across the street. We ran for blocks until we were sure we lost him. Mark explained that he yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street into the patch of woods with his gun. We didn't report him or any of what happened. We just told a few friends and that was it. Luckily the house was many blocks from us, so we never really had to pass it again. I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student and my parents were paying for a house for me to live in. I'm spoiled, I know. Well, the house was modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days anyway. Then things quickly started getting strange. On a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked around the room thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in watching more TV in the living room. I perked up when I thought I heard something from the kitchen. Laughably, I took a pillow with me as, I guess, some sort of weapon and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There, in the middle of the dark kitchen, was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilling out hundreds of the tiny O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak, like the sound weak areas of a wood floor make when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy now. Every little sound must have been making me paranoid. I cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder as the bulk of the storm seemed to be passing overhead. Yet I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember, appreciating the sound of the storm outside, before waking up from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or thud from downstairs. Regardless, I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal, as was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning feeling like I had been drinking all night the night before. I felt sicker than I'd ever felt with any hangover before. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day just as background noise, with a garbage pail by my side in case I had to puke. At midday, I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just one thud I heard, it was 3 or 4. I managed to get out of bed, despite the fact that every time I moved I wanted to puke. I pulled the string to the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me, and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attic. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owners scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things to produce those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises, until that night. I woke up to, at first, what I thought was thunder, still feeling a bit sick. The familiar sound of a thud from up in the attic gave me chills. I pulled the string to the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again, and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could, but before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch-black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping inside of my body, the fear that I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents saw how emotional I was about this, and in a weird sense, I think they believed me. I packed all of my things up with my parents the next day, and moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. I used to work as a maid for some old lady for a couple of weeks when I was 20. She had a really big yet old house on a property that could have been beautiful if she had actually taken care of it. She had 2 acres of land surrounded by woods in 3 directions and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was really dark. She would often keep the blinds shut in some rooms for reasons I didn't understand. I would sometimes open the blinds to let some sunlight in, only to find that she'd have shut them by the next time I entered the room. She lit some rooms by candle, which made the house seem even more prehistoric from the inside. To top it off, the wood floors were creaky as hell just about everywhere in the house. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70 years old. The kind of work Mel would have me do would be mostly physical stuff that she couldn't do very well anymore, like sweeping, dusting, cleaning dishes, doing laundry, sorting mail, and other things of that sort. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or 2. The house had like 4 bedrooms, yet she lived alone, so it wasn't an issue. Well, this takes place over the course of a Friday, and technically a Saturday as well. I arrived as per usual on Friday, speaking very few words to Mel. I dropped my backpack full of my clothes and cosmetics onto the bed in the bedroom that I was going to be sleeping in. As I turned to the door, I saw Mel standing by the doorway. She had a creepy way about her, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't say hello, which wasn't as weird as it sounds. She just instructed me to clean the bedroom right away. After that, she just told me to simply straighten up the whole house, and then she went upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, but I would occasionally hear her walking around upstairs in her bedroom. It was weird, she would seem to walk back and forth. There were no TVs in this house, so I didn't know what she could have been doing. One thing that I found bizarre was how protective she was of her basement. She made it clear it was completely off limits and she didn't want me going down there. Nighttime came and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were a thing, so I didn't even know what time it was. It was probably 9 or 10 o'clock though. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. However, I still had trouble falling asleep given that it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever been in. It felt like hours later that I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was passing my room really slowly. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but then she stopped outside my door this time. I sat up and listened. I could hear the creaking from behind the door of Mel standing there, and it was starting to creep me out. She finally walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from downstairs. I had a feeling it was the basement door. It was a while later that I heard the door open and close again, and then heavy, slow footsteps coming up the creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came to my door, then stopped. I sat up once again to listen, and I could hear creaks of pressure on the floor outside the door, and then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I laid back down and pulled the sheets over me and pretended to be asleep. I heard Mel take a few steps into the room, pause, and then leave. She went back to her room and shut the door. I was a bit disturbed. This was very bizarre behavior. I waited about half an hour before deciding I had to see what was in that basement. I got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to the door, and then tiptoed down the stairs the best I could. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and crept down the stairs. I made it to the bottom step, and held in the urge to scream. There were 2 old wooden chairs, dead center in the basement, and there were 2 of what I could only describe as decaying corpses with wigs on them sitting in them. The sight of a bug crawling on one of them made me want to puke even more. I brought myself to walk deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I had to make sure they were real. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on them. The bigger of the 2 also had a beret on. I don't know much about corpses or their rate of decaying, but I'd say these corpses were both almost a year old. I felt like my heart stopped momentarily when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs on the first floor. I couldn't make it to the light switch. I had no time. I hid behind one of the couches in the basement as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down one creaky stair at a time. I had my hands covering my mouth as I heard Mel reach the last stair. I heard her whisper my name. For half a second, I looked around the couch and saw Mel halfway across the basement already with a big kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me, so I ran for it to the stairs. She screamed my name and followed as fast as she could. When I made it to the first floor of the house, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I was sleeping in to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back downstairs, Mel was at the top basement step. I ran out the front door and to my car. I turned it on, caught my breath, looked to the front door of the big old house, and saw Mel standing there. I drove off the huge property and down the road, making it back home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, I never gave Mel any of my information, such as my address or my phone number, so she was never able to contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she'd mentioned twice to me. As for the other smaller corpse, I have no idea. But regardless, it was a disturbing scene to witness, and something was way off about that woman. Last year on Christmas Eve, I was working late. I'm 23, I work in New York City and commute home every day on the train. Since I'm one of the younger ones in the office, I got stuck with one of the worst shifts, so I wasn't able to get home until 5 o'clock. My family had already left a whole hour earlier to go to my cousin's house, so I had to drive alone. After having a quick snack before the half-hour drive, I got back in my car and put my cousin's address into my phone. Halfway through the drive, it started snowing. I got to my cousin's house around 6 o'clock. It was snowing heavily by this point, and I just made it in time to catch everyone starting dinner. I brought all of my gifts inside and cheerfully said hey to everyone. I stayed until around 11 o'clock. The rest of my family left a little sooner. I stayed an extra half hour or so just to hang out before leaving myself. By the time I was leaving, the ground had accumulated at least 2 feet of snow, and it wasn't even done snowing. The drive home was nightmarish. The roads were hardly even plowed, and I had to drive under 20 miles per hour on most roads. The roads were completely dead at this point though, most likely because everyone was smart enough to go home before the snow accumulated. Eventually I turned onto a main road that I'm sure would usually be bustling, but at 11:15 on Christmas Eve night, there wasn't a single car or a single light from a store. It was a ghost town. But then I did notice the flashing taillights of one car. It was parked on the side of the road, and the smoke seeping out from its exhaust with the taillights giving it a red tint. As I got closer, I realized there was somebody next to the car waving their hand in the air. I assumed something was wrong and they needed help, so me being the good Samaritan I am, I pulled up behind the car. When I opened my door, the guy approached me immediately, barely even giving me time to step out. He was an average-sized man, probably 5'10", 180 pounds. He spoke in a very demanding voice, asking me if I know anything about fixing an engine. I told him I didn't know much about cars. The guy responded very quickly to everything I said. He told me it's fine. He went inside of his car for a second, popped open his trunk, came back out and told me to just wait by the trunk for a second. I had no idea what he wanted me to do. I was really confused. He walked over to the front of his car, and I heard him open the hood. I couldn't see anything he was doing since the trunk was blocking my view, and the loud wind of the snowstorm overpowered any small noises he might have been making. I put my hand on the back of the car and leaned my body in anticipation, when suddenly I heard 3 or 4 quick and aggressive footsteps in the snow behind me before I was pushed into the trunk. The man tried to close the trunk on me, but I kicked my feet up in resistance and held it up. I was able to overpower him and kick the trunk open completely. As I took advantage of the few seconds I had to get out of the trunk, I took out my keys. He tried to grab me now, and I dug my house key right into his neck. He fell to his knees and his scream echoed down the deserted street. I was in my car and halfway down the road before he could even get up from his knees. A little further down, I called 911 and reported the guy. I came back in 10 minutes to find blue and red lights illuminating the windows of the deserted stores. The police held him until the ambulance arrived for him. I watched the whole thing, and nothing ever felt better in my life. I got home safely half an hour later and told my family everything. I was still very shaken that Christmas, and this remains possibly the most horrific thing I've ever experienced. It was Christmas Eve, 2009. I was 18 years old, working at CVS. Unfortunately, I got stuck with a closing shift on Christmas Eve, meaning I'd be the only one there until midnight. I was considering quitting over it, but my parents weren't for that. The CVS was 5 miles from my house on a rather quiet corner on a dead-end street. During the day, it would normally be busy, at least busy enough to stay in business, but past 8 o'clock it would be uncommon to see any customers. On Christmas Eve night, I didn't expect to see a single soul past 8 o'clock. My shift started at 4, and it was surprisingly busy for the first few hours. As I expected, past 8 o'clock it really started to die down. The pharmacy closed at 10 tonight for Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, that meant I'd be alone at the register up front for 2 hours. Plus, I had a crush on the girl who was working the pharmacy, and we were talking most of the time the store was empty, so I was upset she was leaving. A whole hour went by, and I only rang up one customer. Come 11 o'clock, I was already getting excited for my shift to end. I'd been the only one in the entire building besides one customer for the past hour, and I was losing my mind. Suddenly, there was a very slight tap on the window. It didn't sound intentional though, it sounded more so like somebody's zipper accidentally scraped against the glass. I turned to look out the window and saw a man out there, heavy coat on, hood over his head, baggy jeans, and black boots. He was staring right at me. A few seconds after he realized that I noticed him, he walked over to the entrance and entered the store. He stared at me as he walked past and down one of the aisles before disappearing behind the shelves. Then, 5 minutes later, the tapping noise began. It sounded like it was coming from one of the aisles. I walked a little to the right behind the counter just to check down the aisle. Nobody was there though. The tapping was so consistent and deliberate, I knew it was the man making the noise. But where was it coming from? I didn't know, but I had a sudden urge to go to the bathroom. Only problem, I wasn't supposed to go to the bathroom when there was a customer in the store and I was alone with them. 10 minutes or so passed and I didn't see the customer, but I would occasionally hear the weird tapping noise coming from one of the aisles. It got to the point that I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out from behind the counter and called out, excuse me? I started walking around the aisles, looking for this man that walked in. He was nowhere to be seen, but every aisle I entered, I would hear noises coming from the next aisle over. I walked down the candy aisle and heard some of the sleigh bells jingling on the other side of the shelf, like someone was intentionally shaking them. I tried to peek through the tiny holes in the shelves to see if I could see him. I saw something completely unexpected and horrifying instead. I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me through the tiny holes in the shelf. The eyes moved away, and then the tall man entered the aisle I was in. He was making these weird noises like a child or someone who had just escaped a mental asylum. He started laughing and doing this weird tiptoe kind of hopping over to me. It sounds funny, but it was a straight up disturbing scene, and he was approaching so fast that I actually began to fear for my life. I started walking away from him, and he followed me everywhere in his weird hopping. I was back at the front of the store, ready to call my manager or the cops. Then I looked back at him and saw that he was frozen at the end of the first aisle, maybe 20 feet away from me. His goofy, eerily happy face turned to an aggressive, angry-looking stare of malice. I was officially done with this and walked out the front door, and to my horror, the man started charging at me. No more goofy hopping around, he was sprinting at me. I ran outside the store, too afraid to go to my car, because I feared he'd get me before I could lock the door. I ran around back and entered through the back door, which was still unlocked. I didn't know if he was still on my tail or not. I locked the door and hurried to the front of the store, where I locked the front door too. That was when I picked up the phone on the counter and called my manager, who was luckily still awake. I told him I had to leave immediately because somebody crazy was following me. Then I thought I heard something over my conversation. It was coming from inside the store. I put the phone down and realized it was the tapping again, coming from one of the aisles. I was out of that store and in my car within 20 seconds. I never came back. I called my manager when I got back home, and he called the cops. Surprisingly, nothing was stolen, or so I heard from a friend. My manager obviously wasn't too fond of me for leaving his store like that, so I never spoke to him again. I had as normal of a Christmas as possible, given what happened the day before. I used to play a lot of hide and seek with my friends when we were young. A team version of the game though, so it was a little different. Instead of having a lone seeker who tags anybody, we would have a team of seekers and a team of hiders. And for the hiders to win, they would have to get to a certain checkpoint, and seekers would win if they tagged all the hiders. To tag one of the hiders, the seeker would have to two-hand touch their back, just like touch football. It started when we all formed our group on the block around 8 years old, all the way up until we were about 13. I lived in a cul-de-sac where there were 3 other houses besides mine, and kids my age lived in each one. There were also 4 other kids right outside the cul-de-sac around our age, so ever since I was little I had a group of neighboring friends. When we would play hide and seek, we would usually play in the cul-de-sac, since there was a lot of open space, trees, bushes, and each of the houses belonged to one of us, so we could use all the property space for the game as well. Plus, the cul-de-sac was right in front of our town's nature preserve park, so it also made it more fun to have the woods as an added hiding spot. It was 2008. I was 11 years old, a time and age we would still play hide and seek on Friday nights instead of going out to flirt with girls. We had only 6 of us this night, so we divided our 2 teams into 3s and split up. We were first to hide. The other team began counting down from 30, while we all went our separate ways to different houses. I ran to my next door neighbor's house and came up with a really creative idea. My friend had a green blanket outside on his patio, sitting under a couple flower pots. I carefully moved the flower pots and took the green blanket, folding it over my body and crawling over to the bushes near the edge of the woods. Since our houses met the edge of the nature preserve, we could all choose if we wanted a back fence or not, and my next door neighbors chose not to have one, meaning the woods connected to some of our backyards. I heard the backyard gate open, so I quickly ran into the woods and knelt down under the green blanket. I would occasionally lift the blanket over my head to see who was there, and eventually I saw one of my friends creeping around the backyard, checking under the table and such. So while they were distracted, I waddled on my knees to the backyard of the next house over, where I could hear the commotion of one of my teammates getting caught. I lifted the blanket over my head to see what was going on, and I saw someone on the other team escorting my teammate back outside to the street. This was the perfect opportunity for me to run for it. I dropped the blanket completely and just looked around one last time before getting ready to make a break for it. Then, the most unexpected happened. The sound of a shoe on freshly fallen leaves and twigs snapped from right behind my ears, and before I could even turn around, I felt 2 hands grab my shoulders with a very strong and tight grip. I squealed in pain for a bit and screamed stop, managing to escape the grip and run for the checkpoint. I didn't make it to the checkpoint anyway though, because I ran into one of the seekers right at the backyard gates. We went out to the street where I found out that both of my teammates were already out, and the 2 other seekers were already waiting by the street. "Wait," I said. "If all of you guys are already out here, who was the one who found me in the woods?" I asked. They all looked at each other, seemingly confused. None of them owned up to it. They all swore they hadn't even gone into the woods. As I realized they were telling the truth, I felt my heart skip a few beats before pumping back up in a rapid beat, twice as fast as normal. When I told them that somebody was in the woods and grabbed me with force, they didn't believe me at first, but I convinced them. We all went to tell our parents, and the cops were called. Unfortunately for my neighbor friend, his parents put up a 4th fence wall, separating the woods to the backyard. We continued to play hide and seek and flashlight tag past this incident up until around the age of 13. Our parents just made us carry flashlights from now on and left all the backyard lights on. And of course, the woods were off limits. I'm happy to have such fond memories with friends as a young child, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that this was one of the most horrifying experiences of my life. This happened when I was 10 years old. I lived in a small town in New York State that didn't have much going on at all. The house next door to mine was vacant for the longest time, until one day a moving truck pulled up in front, and a woman, a kid my age, and a toddler stepped out. Me and my dad had been sitting on the stoop talking, so we were able to go over and greet them right away. The mom seemed pretty normal, though there was something slightly off about her personality. My dad and the mom introduced me and the other boy my age to each other. He introduced himself as CJ, and then reached out his hand for a handshake, which for kids our age at the time was very weird. I shook his hand, and I remember both of our parents laughed. My dad ended up pressuring me on the spot to go hang out with CJ upstairs in my room. I wasn't against it, so I led him up to my room. I sat down on my bed, and he just stared at me blankly, creepily. I asked him if he wanted to play Mario Kart, and he didn't even know what that was. I showed him a few of my video games, and he said he doesn't like video games. So I suggested we play hide and seek outside. That he agreed to. I told him he could hide first to familiarize himself with the properties, while I gave him a 60-second head start. He ran into his new backyard, and I started counting down from 60. When it came time to find him, I found him in literally the most obvious place he could be. He was standing behind the chimney, a spot that I had to pass to get into the backyard. From this point on, I was starting to wonder if maybe this kid wasn't all there. After 10 minutes of an anticlimactic game of hide and seek, I said I had homework to do. He asked if he could come inside with me, and I didn't know what to say. Every excuse I came up with, he would find another way of asking to come inside. Eventually, however, he did leave me alone, and I went inside. Realistically, I had nothing to do. I just didn't like the kid and didn't want to further any kind of friendship with him. That night, something terrifying happened. I awoke to a thud at my bedside window. I sat up and lifted the window up. I was disturbed to see CJ's face at the upstairs window of the neighboring house. He leaned out his window and called out for me to come over and play hide and seek. I yelled over he's insane and told him to go back to sleep and leave me alone. I aggressively slammed my window shut, as well as the blind, and tried to go back to sleep. Two more times a rock or something was thrown at my window, but I ignored it. When it seemed to stop, I was relieved, and finally felt at ease. 10 minutes or so later, I heard a noise coming from below my window outside. It sounded like a bird was hopping around the ledge or something possibly. The sound kept getting closer though, and then I heard a thud come from right below my window. I didn't know what to think. What if CJ was out there? Was he trying to climb up to my window? The thought of it was so disturbing it was almost comical. Then I heard the slightest creak of the floorboards near my bedroom door. I turned to face the doorway and screamed at the sight of CJ standing at my door in his pajamas. He said in a quiet voice, "Let's play hide and seek." My dad was in the room quicker than I could even get out of my bed. He was just as shocked and disturbed as I was. He angrily marched over to the new neighbor's house with CJ in his grip. I watched the whole thing through my window. He raised his voice quite a few times. It turned out CJ simply entered through an unlocked window downstairs. My dad got a restraining order against the woman and her son. Unfortunately, they weren't going anywhere though. For months after this incident, I would have to awkwardly avoid eye contact with the mother next door the few times I saw her. Strangely, I never once saw CJ outside of the house again. However, every single night for over a month, I would check outside my bedroom window across to the other house and see CJ just sitting by his window looking into mine with his creepy blank stare. It got to a point where I eventually left the blinds to that window closed 24/7, and eventually it stopped. CJ and his mom moved out less than a year later, and luckily I never saw them again. In the year 2014, I frequently used the app Uber because I wasn't able to drive for 12 months due to some DUI charges. Just a stupid mistake overall. There's this nightclub bar in my town that I would sometimes go to on the weekends with my friends. Sometimes I would get a ride home with a designated driver if we had one, and sometimes we would catch an Uber. This night I wasn't feeling too great, so I left a little early. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning. It was way too cold to walk home, so I called for an Uber. A guy nearby named Alex popped up, and I gotta be honest, he was a little creepy looking. He was older, didn't really smile in his picture, and he had a grayish goatee with a black beanie cap on. He was only 2 miles away, so I didn't really care. It said he had a Chevy Malibu, which sounded nice, so I requested he come pick me up. I waited on the bench outside the club next to the bouncer, who stood still like a statue, hands folded together. About 5 minutes later, a silver 2003 or something Chevy Malibu pulled up in front of the club. I stood up, a bit disappointed. It was such an old, ratty looking car. The guy didn't call me over or honk or anything, he just waited by the curb, so I got up and entered the back seat of the car. Right away, things got uncomfortable. He didn't say hello, he didn't shake my hand, he didn't even turn his head to look at me. All he said was in a very quiet voice, "Where are you headed?" To which I replied with my address. We began moving down Main Street, but in the wrong direction of my house. I told him this, and he turned left at the next intersection. Now we were moving away from the main roads and down the quieter residential areas. He didn't put my address into his phone, so I felt really strange. I didn't know if he was expecting me to direct him or not. I ended up putting my address into my own phone so he could listen. When the GPS said turn left down the next street, he completely missed it. I made a confused hand gesture. He noticed it and said, "I just gotta make a quick stop, don't worry, I'll give you a discount." Even though I was drunk, I still knew something bad was going on. Then, that's when I noticed the handgun sticking out from his middle glove box next to him. By now, I was trying to figure out how to get out of this car. At the next red light, I tried the door handle very quietly, but it wouldn't open. I saw that the child lock was on, and from this point forward, my heart was racing. The man was driving us far out of the direction of my house. We must have been 2 towns over by now. I was getting desperate. I couldn't call the cops because I didn't know what this guy might do. I figured my best option would be attempting to flick the child lock switch next to him by the front seats. I had to somehow slide over to the opposite side of the back seat behind him without him noticing. This was one of the most tense moments of my life. I locked my sight on his head through the rearview mirror, making sure he wasn't looking. I very casually slid behind him. Thankfully, he didn't notice. Now came the scariest part. I had to reach for the button up front at the next red light before he could do anything. Each light we passed, I felt more and more tension build up as I was waiting for one of them to turn yellow, and eventually, one finally did. He slowed the car at an intersection that would usually be busy during daylight hours. It was a perfect escape point. The car came to a stop. I knew this light wasn't very long, so I had to be quick. A car was stopped at the opposite side of the intersection, which made me feel a little better. With all of my courage, I reached my hand up to the lit-up child lock button, and I must have startled him because he jumped 2 inches out from his seat. He screamed at me, and as I feared he would, he went for the gun right next to him. I was able to open the door and flee to the nearby Cadillac Escalade, where I banged on their windows asking for help. They drove off, completely avoiding me, but it didn't matter because the man in his Chevy Malibu was already gone down the block. I ran into a nearby grocery store that was open 24 hours, where I called a taxi this time. This was a very sobering experience because I don't remember being drunk at all in that store or during the taxi ride home. I reported the driver to Uber, who said they would escalate the situation to the authorities. It wasn't until a whole week later that an officer finally showed up at my front door for some questioning, and that was the end of that. I have no idea what became of that guy, but I've never used an Uber since. As a former Uber driver, I've dealt with a whole bunch of unpleasant characters, from the drunken groups of friends on Saturday nights, to the people who pretend to be handicapped to get free rides. but every so often you may pick up somebody who can just be classified as a straight-up creep. I've picked up a few of these guys, but never one quite as bad as a guy named Tom. It was a Friday night in December, one of the coldest nights of the year. I had nothing to do, so I figured I'd do some late-night pickups. This was 2 years ago. I was 18 and had a new Honda Accord. My parents kind of spoiled me a bit. I was a very skinny 18-year-old though. That's why my dad told me to always keep a blade in my car, because you never know what kind of nuts are getting into the car. A guy named Tom popped up a couple miles away by a major shopping area. I responded to his request and started driving in that direction. I pulled up in front of the shopping center where I saw a group of teenagers hanging out. It looked like trouble. I hoped this Tom guy wasn't part of this group. A bunch of them looked at me in my car as I slowly passed. Eventually I just hit the gas and went further into the parking lot of the shopping center, wanting to get away from this group. I did 2 laps around the whole parking lot until I finally noticed through my left mirror somebody approaching my car from behind. I rolled down my window and called out Tom, and he called back yes. I told him to hop in. I had to repeat myself 3 times, and given that all I was saying was hop in very clearly, made the situation very weird from the start. The 4th time he finally understood me and walked slowly around the back, getting into the seat right behind me. Usually the people I picked up would sit diagonally from me, which is what I preferred. When people sat right behind me, it just made me a little paranoid sometimes, especially when the person seemed kind of creepy. This guy was old. He had to be in his upper 40s. "Where to?" I asked him. He told me an address, which I entered into my phone. By his voice, I could tell he was a very heavy smoker. Come to think of it, my car was starting to smell like cigarettes too. The address he gave me was 10 miles away, which was fine, since it meant I'd be making more money. I tried making small talk initially, which didn't work out too well. Like if I would ask him a yes or no question, sometimes he would just mumble, and any other questions led to dry responses. I stopped talking when he completely ignored one of my questions. That was within just 5 miles. There was still 5 to go. By the 6-mile mark, things started getting uneasy in there. I was afraid to look into the rearview mirror because I was so sure that he was staring at me. I took a quick half-second glance and saw I was right. He was in fact staring at me. My body forced my foot down heavier on the gas. I wanted this ride to be over sooner. By the 8-mile mark, I started to realize we were in the middle of nowhere. We were on basically a deserted street with woods on either side and occasional buildings. I was growing suspicious now as to where this address he told me actually was. So, while driving, I dragged my finger across my phone to slide the map in the direction of the address. It seemed to lead to a dead-end street with no surrounding streets nearby. I was getting more and more nervous with each passing minute now. I shot a glance back up again at the mirror, and he was still watching me. I finally summed up the courage to ask him if the address he gave me was of his house. There was silence for a few moments, and I thought he was once again going to ignore me, or possibly didn't hear me, but 5 seconds later he finally answered yes. There was less than a mile left in the drive now, still surrounded by nothing but woods with the occasional empty-looking building. I was approaching the dead-end street that the address he gave me resided on, hoping some houses would come into sight. As the street came up, I slowed down so I could get a good look of it, but nothing could be seen. Just pitch blackness. I could only imagine why he wanted to get me out here alone, so far away from anybody or anything. I casually kept driving, pretending like I missed it, hoping he wouldn't notice, but he did. Instantly, he hopped out of his seat and yelled at me to turn around. Honestly, I felt like my life was on the line, so I apologized and did a quick 3-point turn. As I was reapproaching the dead-end street, I dug my hands into the netting compartment on the side of my seat where I kept my blade. I very quietly flicked the blade open and held it tight in my right hand, ready to use it. I turned down the dead-end road, with my headlights now displaying just what I thought I would see. Nothing but trees on either side. I made it to the end of the road, not a single house or building on the road. I just knew something was about to go down. I was just trying to physically and mentally prepare myself for it. Suddenly he said in as soft as a voice as he probably could, "Thanks for the ride." I wasn't even thinking about money at this point. He opened his door, but before stepping out, he said, "Could you get out of the car for a second? I need help carrying my bag. I have a bad back." But he didn't have a bag. I knew he didn't. He didn't come in with one. I replied, Yeah, sure, let yourself out and I'll help you in a sec." The shakiness in my voice was too obvious. What happened next, I never imagined would have happened. All of a sudden, I felt pressure on my neck. It took me at least a second before I could realize he was choking me from the back seat. Immediately, I drilled the blade into his left arm and he screamed in pain, releasing his grip on my neck. He fell out of the car and onto the street, and I took that opportunity to turn the car around and practically floor it down the street until I returned to a busy road. I actually didn't end up calling the cops. I was just too scared to do anything but drive home. And by the time I got home, I just wanted to go to sleep and forget about it. Needless to say, I resigned from my Uber driving days after this incident.
I started at 16 in my town in the suburbs of a big city. At first, they put me to help the chef in the kitchen and clean the place and stuff. 2 months later, my boss told me that on the days off of the main delivery boy, I would deliver, and I said yes, of course. Then all of a sudden, the delivery boy quit when he came from delivering a pizza at this one house. He looked traumatized and shaken, like something with his face and his eyes. He went into my boss's office and they argued for about 15 minutes. Then he came out and said, "Good luck, kid," then told me he had quit. I asked why and he said, "Just a shitty job, that's all." He then patted me on the back and left. I knew it was something else than just a shitty job, but I didn't think much of it. That was the last time I saw him. So for the next couple of weeks, I was the delivery boy till they could find someone that can deliver pizzas. About 2 weeks into me delivering pizzas, my boss gave me the address to a house, and as usual I put in the GPS and went over. Watching the sunset while driving over there, I was hoping it'd take 2 minutes tops so I could get home. Unfortunately, it was in the rural side of town, where the houses are like a quarter mile from each other. I stopped in front of the 2-floor house and looked at it. I got the creepiest feels when I stared at it. Lawn not cut, with weeds, dead trees, and the old porch with no chairs or flower pots or tables, just plain. It seemed abandoned, but I got out anyways and knocked on the door. I was hoping my boss gave me the wrong address or something so I could get the hell out of there. Then the door lock started to shake and the door opened. It was an old lady, at least 70 years old or something around there, with white hair, teeth missing, and skinny, very short too, but her eyes just glaring at me. It really freaked me out. I figured if I was nice, things would turn out okay after all. "Pepperoni pizza, ma'am?" I said as friendly as I could. "Yes," she said with a hoarse voice as if she had a sore throat. "Alrighty, here you go." I handed the pizza over, but she just looked at it with no emotion and didn't take it, getting her purse. "Did you come with someone else?" I froze, then quickly looked up at her, still glaring at me. That question really frightened me. No," I said. "Where's the other one? He ran off on me last time he came." Ran off, I thought. It didn't make sense. "He quit some weeks ago," I said. Then she got her purse and started searching for money, or so I thought. She did for about a minute, the longest minute ever, and with the hands in her purse, she stopped and looked at me, not in a look of surprise or in confusion, but just like as if she was thinking really hard on something. I could tell she was holding something in her right hand inside the purse, but I couldn't see what. I really started to freak out at this point. What if it was pepper spray, or a knife, or even a gun? I mean, what could take her so long to get $10 out of her purse? Then, behind her, I saw a shadow. A silhouette of a man coming to the door, and all of a sudden, I heard footsteps crushing the leaves on my left side next to the porch, and a man's deep voice saying, "Hey." I looked over and saw a head of a middle-aged man with a look of anger peeking over the porch. This guy then started to climb the porch, and that was when I realized I had enough. I darted to my car, threw the pizza inside, turned it on, and drove off. I didn't look back as I drove off in the dark. I had to lie and pay for the pizza out of my own pocket, but it was worth it. On the day I quit, I decided to tell my boss what happened that evening, to which he freaked out as well and asked me why I hadn't told him. He said James told him something like he just walked out of there and didn't pay attention to her. My boss then called the cops to look into the sketchy situation, and he told me I could leave. About 2 days later, he called back, saying the cops had the house registered as foreclosed for over a year, and they found 3 people living in there when they broke in, which were 2 men and the old lady I encountered. They were arrested, and he didn't tell me anything else. I'm still traumatized, and I don't know what would have happened if I would have waited. They could have easily jumped me, but thank God I quit afterwards, and I'm still alive. I'll never forget the time I was covering my friend's shift at a pizzeria we worked at. He was the delivery boy, while I was usually the one manning the register. On that night, I made 2 real deliveries to normal people. Then, my manager gave me one final delivery for the night. It was 5 miles away, which was a long drive for what I was used to. The GPS told me to turn off the highway into some very quiet town. Somehow, I'd never even heard of this town. The GPS took me down some side roads that were even more dead than the main streets in this town. Half of the street lights weren't even on. I didn't like the looks of this place. I just wanted to deliver the pizza and be gone. So I arrived to the house. It was a single-floor little thing. I rang the bell, and almost immediately the door swung open. There was an older man, maybe in his upper 50s, that opened the door. His few hairs left on his head were gray, and he had a very pale face with a gray mustache. He gave me a smile and told me he'd be right back. He walked away into his house out of view, and I just stood there in the cold, waiting for him. I was a little uncomfortable with the area, and the looks of the guy answering didn't help. The sound of stomping on the creaky floors inside the house came to the door, as the man appeared back in the doorway with a smile. He said I should come inside where it's warm while I waited. I told him it's okay, but he just started nudging for me to come inside. I cannot justify my actions, but it was like 5 degrees outside. I foolishly stepped inside the sketchy stranger's house. He shut the door behind me and stepped off into another room in a hurry. It wasn't even much warmer in the house. He clearly didn't even have a heating system. I found myself creeping closer and closer to the door as I got more uncomfortable. Then, the man came out of another room and gave me another smile. He opened up a door, apparently leading to the basement. He looked down and told me that he normally leaves his money down there. He asked me to come down there with him, but I refused. Even from where I was standing, I could see it was totally pitch dark down there. And then, what happened next is where it all fell apart. I heard the sound of a creaking step coming from the basement. Somebody else was down there. I decided it was time to go and turned around to open the door, but the man was already right on top of me. I punched him in the face and managed to get him in a hold, but I heard somebody stomping up the basement steps, and I had to get out of there. I pushed the man to the floor, ran outside, got in my car, and drove off without looking back. I told my manager everything, and he called the cops, but I don't know whatever became of that. My manager gave me a couple days off afterwards. Since then, I am much wiser to the fact that you should never enter a stranger's house. I was out doing a delivery one late night. It was probably the longest drive I have ever taken for a pizza delivery. From the pizza place I worked at, it was a 20-minute drive, which isn't too crazy out where I live. Plus, they ordered 4 large pies, so I figured it was a party and I would get a much bigger tip. Navigating the dirt roads at night was always annoying though. I pulled up to the given address. It was some old, sketchy-looking building, literally in the middle of a forest clearing. There were no cars parked anywhere, or any lights on. I put my car in park and called my boss. I asked him to reread the address at least 3 times to make sure I typed it in right, but that checked out. I could tell he was in a really bitchy mood, and he told me to at least knock on the door and check it out. He would normally get mad if we took back 1 pie, but I was afraid of what he would do if I brought back 4. I was insanely unnerved, but got out anyway and forced myself to the front door of the building. There was no doorbell, so I just knocked really hard. I heard nothing and didn't really expect to hear anything. I was extremely disappointed, not because nobody answered the door, but because I was realizing that it was all a waste of time and gas. I knocked 1 more time out of desperation, and then began to hear some kind of rustling noises from inside of the building. I knocked again and yelled that I was the pizza guy. There was silence now. I felt a bit more uncomfortable now than before. But before I could turn around, I noticed something at the window. There was someone looking through the window. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. All I noticed were their eyes. Their eyes were open wider than I knew possible, staring intently at me. I was disturbed enough by this and dropped the pizzas and ran back to my car. The shitty thing wouldn't start until turning the key for the 3rd time. I drove off the grass and back onto the dirt road, but I felt the car rocking about, shaking and bumping. Something wasn't right. I didn't make it far from the building before I started hearing a sharp scraping sound coming from outside. There was so much resistance that I couldn't even drive. The car came to a stop. I got out of the car to check what the hell was wrong. A chill ran up my spine as I began to feel like my heart was constantly skipping beats. My tires had been slashed and had completely fallen off the rim. Not just the front though. All 4 tires were slashed. I realized somebody did this when I was knocking on the door to that building. Instead of running, I got back in the car and locked the doors. I was so close to that building, I could practically see it from where I was, if it weren't for the trees blocking the view. I dialed 911 and explained everything to the operator. She told me the cops would be over as soon as possible and that I need to stay hidden. I asked her if it was advisable to stay in the car or run, and she told me it would be best to stay in the car with the door locked. She asked me to stay on the line with her until the cops arrived. My whole body was shaking. In all directions, there was nothing but dark, seemingly endless forest. I knew it would take forever for the cops to get there. I was not comfortable with sitting in that car so close to whoever did this. The next part, though, is what utterly destroyed me. It still shakes me to this day, and I hope nobody ever has to experience this kind of fear.